Hey everyone, Sky here to discuss A Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984, starring Amanda Wyss, Blake Lee Ronnie, Charles Fleischer, Heather Langenkamp, John Saxon, Johnny Depp, Zoo Garcia, Nicky Corey, and Robert Englund, and directed by Wes Craven. Now, I've seen this movie loads of times in my life, and will I like it now? Well, let's get into the movie because I'm a fan of the series. And so far, well, let's get into it and then we'll see. The New Line Cinema logo is a red dot matrix looking logo. When we open the movie with a creepy, perfect score to this movie of Fred Krueger, played by Robert Englund, builds a menacing glove with knives. And how creepy is that as an opener? Because to me, it's fucking haunting. Then we move to Tina's dream, where she's running around and away from Fred Krueger, who was horribly burned by the parents of Springwood, Ohio, who lives on Elm Street, where Freddy terrorizes the kids. And let me just say, Robert Englund as Freddy Krueger is the perfect casting choice. And you can't avoid having dreams. You can avoid going trick or treating on Halloween, and you can avoid going to summer camp, and you can avoid going into the ocean for sharks. But the dream thing is a genius idea for a horror movie, in my opinion. Tina tells Nancy Thompson, played by Heather Langenkamp, and Glenn Lance, played by Johnny Depp in his first acting role, about the dream she had. And Nancy and Glenn spend the night at her place, and Nancy dreams about the same burned up person with finger knives. And honestly, the acting is bad in this movie and laughable, including Rod Lane, who sleeps with Tina while she's asleep. And the best actor in this movie, in my opinion, is Robert Englund. As creepy as his presence is, makes this movie work very well, but the acting doesn't quite work for me. Tina dreams Tina dreams of Freddy again and gets killed as she screams, and honestly, everybody screams too much in this movie. That's how bad the acting is, in general, I think. But I do like the sick things Freddy Krueger thinks of during the movies, as I'll go through them. For example, he cuts a few fingers in this scene, while Nancy dreams the wall is shaped as Freddy and drops the cross of Jesus while she's asleep. And I love how bad the acting is here. It's making me laugh harder than any of the Friday the 13th movies, where all the characters are bad, but here only Freddy Krueger steals the show, in my opinion. Lieutenant Thompson, who's Nancy's father and played by John Saxon, who died recently, may he rest in peace, wonders why Nancy was at Tina's house when she got killed, and her mother Marge, played by Ronnie Blakely, for some reason I spelled that backwards, oops, thinks Nancy is crazy. And next day, Nancy, who bumps into Rod Lane as she walks to school, and remind me, why is Nancy going to school after the murder of her best friend? Which doesn't make any sense. Meanwhile, Nancy falls asleep in class, which you should never do, by the way. And dreams of Freddy as she's having the dream. She screams and disrupts class, and again, why the hell would she go to school after the murder of her best friend and fall asleep in class? Which didn't make any sense to me at all. Then she gets a bruise from her dream, and is genius writing. The iconic scene of Nancy falling asleep in the bathtub, and Freddy's glove grabbing her into the tub, and again, another genius writing for Mr. Craven, as he's a good writer for ideas of what dreams could do to you in this movie. Glenn comes over from across the street to Nancy's house. Yes, they're neighbors. And yes, they live across the street from each other. And Nancy asks Glenn to check on Nancy when she's asleep and dreaming of seeing Rod as he's asleep. And Freddy kills Rod with the bed sheet in the jailhouse. And Freddy chases after Nancy and catches up with Glenn as Glenn was asleep, which is a shit move on the script. And Rod is dead by being hung by life by, like I said, a bed sheet. And Lieutenant Thompson checks his pulse as he's dead. And Marge gets Nancy some help about her dream. And all of this is so funny until Nancy gets Freddy's hat from her dream. And I never knew in the movies people can get something from someone they grab in the dreams. And that maybe to me was a good choice. Nancy begs Marge how to tell her about Freddy Krueger, and she's very hesitant. Nancy leaves the house to hang out with Glenn and gets a book about booby traps, and she comes home and sees Marge puts up some bars to make the house look like a prison for security reasons, and Marge tells her about the death of 40 kids in the Elm Street neighborhood and how Freddy Krueger got freed from going to prison and the parents of Elm Street burned him alive, and assumes he's dead, but shows up in her dreams, and Nancy calls Glenn to tell him her plan to catch Freddy out of her dream and tells him not to fall asleep until he does, and Glenn gets killed in an X rating kind of way. And the reason I called it that was because if you don't know, back in the day there was such a thing as an X rating, and the MPAA almost gave the movie an X rating for the amount of blood we see from Glenn's death, and Wes Craven confirmed it was the body of the other victims, which gave them an R rating instead. And I love Freddy's line as he calls Nancy and says, and let me do my best Freddy Krueger impression, "I'm your boyfriend now, Nancy." That wasn't very good, but moving on. And licks her ear, that was hysterical. And Nancy tries to leave the house, but Marge locks everything up, and Glenn's parents calls 911 about the amount of blood in Glenn's bedroom roof, and Nancy makes a proposition for her father to capture Freddy Krueger, and she goes Rambo by setting up the booby traps, which didn't work for me, but I do like the death of Glenn, scene anyways, with all the blood, and Marge acts like a drunkard, and the story of how Freddy was killed in the iconic story of the origin of a serial dream killer, I'll say, was fantastic. Nancy falls asleep and finds Freddy and calls him out and goes after him some more and makes him chase her, and she grabs him and wakes up, and he's in the real world and traps him, and Nancy calls out her father, but the officer who's helping him is too stupid to call her father, and Nancy gets Freddy on fire and traps him in the basement, and Freddy goes upstairs to kill Marge and goes back to the dream world until Nancy says to Freddy as he rises from the bed, and Nancy is no longer afraid of him and tells him he's shit. And he disappears, and it's daytime, and the mother is alive. Glenn, Rod, and Tina drive by and picks up Nancy, and they drive away in the Freddy mobile, and Marge is still dead, and as twist endings works quite well, and the climax works very well as well. Now it's time for the rating. I'll give this movie a 8.3 out of 10. There's a lot of genius in the script, and Wes Craven did create the best ideas in horror movie 101. Robert Englund is the best thing about this movie, as the other characters are awful in this movie, but it's a great time to laugh at with Freddy, and may not be the only one. I'll get to more of this when the series progresses. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me, and next week I will be back with The Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge. And until next time, dream on.